The snow was still falling over Dachau in February 1942, soft enough to look innocent, cold enough to kill a man. The guards joked about how the prisoners didn't need bullets this winter. The weather would do it for them. But the men chosen that morning weren't meant to die by accident. They were scheduled for it. At 6 in the morning, the SS physician Sigmund Rascher walked across the yard, the black of his uniform shining against the white frost. His breath steamed through the air as he passed the roll call square. He didn't look at the rows of striped uniforms shivering in formation. He was thinking of a letter he'd received from Himmler 2 days earlier, February 13th, 1942, authorizing experiments vital to the Luftwaffe's survival. Pilots were freezing to death in the North Sea. Someone needed to learn how long a human body could live in ice. That was the official reason. The real one was curiosity. Inside Block 5, the smell of disinfectant and sweat clung to the concrete. A metal vat sat in the middle of the room, filled with water and thin sheets of ice. An orderly dragged in a man, Josef Nowak, 29, schoolteacher once, political prisoner now. Rascher didn't ask his name. He only asked the assistant, "Is the thermometer calibrated?" The gauge read 3 degrees Celsius, close enough to the North Sea. They stripped the man naked and pushed him into the water. The first breath he took turned into a scream that froze halfway out of his throat. Rascher's gloved hands moved with calm precision, attaching electrodes to the chest and temple. "Start the timer," he said. Each minute was a note on a chart, each heartbeat a data point. After 20 minutes, the man's lips were gray. After 40, they were blue-black. When his body went still, Rascher looked at his watch. 52 minutes. He made a note. Subject expired. Core temperature 26 degrees. Exceptional endurance. The assistants waited for an order to remove the corpse. Rascher shook his head. "Leave him. We'll dissect while he's still warm." Outside the block, the camp dogs barked. Snowflakes drifted through the chimney smoke. Inside, the water in the vat was already freezing again around the man's hair. Through March, the tests continued. Some days it was 1 victim, some days 2 at a time. Rascher called that comparative endurance. The guards called it entertainment. Prisoners began whispering about the ice doctors. No one wanted to be sent to Block 5. Being chosen meant never coming back. On March 12, 1942, Rascher tried something new. He had read a theory that rapid rewarming might save a frozen man. That afternoon, he ordered the next subject lifted from the vat and dropped into a tub of boiling water. The man's skin split from wrist to elbow. The assistants looked away. Rascher only said, "Too fast. We'll try radiant heat next." When lamps blistered the flesh off another victim, he noted, "Excessive superficial damage. I need more natural heat." A few days later, he brought in women from the adjacent barracks. They were forced to lie naked beside the frozen men, pressed skin to skin while guards timed the process. Most of the men were already dying. Some revived long enough to gasp before their hearts stopped. Rascher wrote in his log, "Intimate body heat shows potential reanimation effect. Further study required." He photographed everything. The photos were sent to Berlin. By April, the Reichsfuhrer himself came to see. Himmler stepped from his car in the yard, adjusting his spectacles as the wind cut through his greatcoat. Rascher guided him through the laboratory, past the vats, the tables, the charts pinned to the walls. He spoke with pride, like a man showing off an invention. Himmler nodded approvingly and told him, "Continue until the data are sufficient for the Luftwaffe. These subhumans should be honored to die for German science." That night, the fires of the crematorium burned bright enough to tint the falling snow red. Rascher worked by lamplight, writing up results while 2 orderlies carried another body past him on a stretcher. He didn't look up. He only murmured, "Tomorrow we'll test twin exposure." Months blurred together. The ledger filled with numbers, temperatures, times, death marks, each line another erased name. Outside the camp, the war raged on. Inside, the war was fought against the limits of flesh. 3 years later, on a gray morning near the end of April 1945, the gates of Dachau were broken open by men in olive uniforms. The soldiers of the U.S. 45th Infantry walked into silence and stench. One of them found Block 5 still standing. On the tables lay notebooks, electrodes, and a vat half filled with stagnant water. He opened a ledger. The first line read, "Subject 7 died at 1:12 p.m. core temperature 26.4 degrees. The pages were stiff with dried water stains. He stood there for a long time, listening to the echo of dripping from the ceiling. Then he whispered to the medic beside him. They promised a cure. He turned one more page and saw hundreds of entries, all ending with the same word, dead. He shut the book. They froze them alive instead. The medic said nothing. Outside, the snow was melting. Inside, the cold never would. The spring of 1942 thawed the snow, but not the cold inside Block 5. The walls still dripped. The vats still steamed faintly. And the guards carried bodies to the crematorium as if it were routine maintenance. Every dawn, new names were called from the roll. Russians, Poles, priests, sometimes even German political prisoners who had spoken too loudly about compassion. They were stripped, catalogued, and reduced to data before the day was over. Rascher wrote to Himmler, again on the 20th of May. He reported excellent progress and requested additional subjects of stronger constitution. Himmler replied within a week, suggesting that prisoners condemned to death be made available for valuable service to science. That phrase echoed through the camp like a curse. By June, trucks from other prisons arrived at Dachau with chained men inside, replacements for the ones already burned. In the notebooks, the experiments took on code numbers. Trial 12, dual submersion. Trial 13, comparative recovery. Trial 14, full autopsy within 5 minutes of death. The handwriting was neat and blue, the ink unshaken by conscience. When the bodies stiffened faster than expected, Rascher instructed the guards to massage the limbs to prolong circulation. The guards laughed and kicked the corpses instead. On July 10, 1942, a visitor from Berlin arrived, a Luftwaffe doctor named Holzlerner who had studied hypothermia at the University of Kiel. He spoke politely, admired Rascher's precision, and asked if he might observe a demonstration. That afternoon, 2 prisoners were led in, forced into ice water while Holzlerner took notes. Fascinating, he murmured, as one man's pulse flatlined. The heart continues fibrillation even after consciousness ceases. Extraordinary resilience. He would later present those same observations at a conference in Nuremberg, to applause. Rascher's ambition grew with each success. He wanted recognition, medals, authority. In August, he sent Himmler a 20-page report comparing death times by age and nationality. The Reichsführer scribbled in the margin, "Continue until numbers are statistically sufficient." Statistically sufficient meant more deaths. In September, Rascher's wife, Caroline, came to visit. She was glamorous, fond of perfume and furs, and had convinced herself that her husband was doing holy work. Over dinner in the officers' mess, she asked to see the laboratory. Rascher hesitated but finally agreed. That evening she stood beside the vat as a prisoner was lowered in. When the man screamed, she turned away and said, "It's horrible." Rascher corrected her. "It's necessary." She nodded, and later wrote to Himmler praising her husband's devotion to the Reich. Autumn darkened the camp. Leaves turned black under frost. The experiments shifted to rewarming efficiency. Rascher installed heat lamps, water baths of different temperatures, and even a large wooden tub meant for body-to-body revival. Female prisoners were brought from Ravensbrück. Most were too terrified to move. The guards called them the blankets. Rascher recorded every variable, the duration of exposure, the change in heart rate, the moment of death. When a subject revived, he was forced back into the vat the next day to test consistency. Some begged to be shot instead. The requests were denied. In December 1942, Rascher delivered his interim report to Berlin. 51 tests completed. Optimum endurance for human body in 0-degree water, 53 minutes average. Revival by hot bath most effective when administered before cardiac standstill. He recommended new survival suits for Luftwaffe pilots based on these results. None were ever produced. By January 1943, the camp smelled permanently of burnt flesh and carbolic acid. Rascher's assistants had begun to drink heavily. One hanged himself in the barracks. Another was transferred after vomiting during an autopsy. Rascher himself showed no emotion. He simply replaced them with new medics from Munich. On March 10, 1943, 2 SS officers arrived to inspect the records. They leafed through the pages, impressed by the precision. "This is science in its purest form," one said. Rascher smiled, unaware that he had become both indispensable and dangerous. The more he succeeded, the more Himmler trusted him, and the more others envied him. The camp's prisoners heard the whispers too. They began to mark time not by months, but by experiments. The first week of frost, the week of lamps, the week of women. Some carved dates into the walls with spoons. One scratched a prayer, "Lord, if there is a heaven, make it warm." By the summer of 1943, the experiments were producing less data and more corpses. Rascher complained to his superiors that the prisoners were too weak to yield accurate results. Himmler advised him to request fresh material from Buchenwald or Auschwitz. Transport orders followed within days. Meanwhile, Allied bombers crossed the skies above Munich. The roar of engines echoed even inside Dachau. Rascher pretended not to hear. He wrote in his diary on August 21st, "Weather remains favorable for cold trials." That same week, another 20 men died in the vats. Autumn returned again, and with it, the quiet rhythm of killing disguised as medicine. Guards carried clipboards instead of rifles. Doctors wore death like a uniform. Somewhere in Berlin, Rascher's reports were filed in cabinets labeled top secret. None of the numbers carried names, and then, in the winter of 1944, the tide of war turned. The front collapsed, the Reich began to burn, and orders came to destroy sensitive material. Rascher packed his notes in crates and sent them south toward Innsbruck. But the cold followed him. 3 years later, when the Americans reached Dachau and found Block 5 still intact, they opened a drawer and discovered photographs, the ice baths, the electrodes, the faces frozen mid-scream. One soldier whispered, "Who could do this?" Another answered softly, "Doctors." They stood in silence, the chill creeping back through the broken windows. The pages were dated carefully. February 15, 1942. March 12, April 1942, September-December. March 1943, a perfect chronology of cruelty. The Americans gathered the papers, stunned by the precision. One said, "They called it medicine." The medic beside him closed the file and said, "And froze them alive to prove it." Outside, spring was coming again. Inside, the cold remained. By the beginning of 1944, the ice vats were quiet but never empty. The war had turned against the Reich, but inside Dachau, the experiments went on as if victory still depended on them. The prisoners were thinner now, their skin the color of candle wax, their eyes sunken into skulls. Rascher still came every morning at 6, his black gloves spotless, his voice calm as ever. He told his assistants that science demanded perseverance. He told himself that the war would redeem him. He had new orders from Himmler: consolidate the data, perfect the methods, and prepare a final report for the Luftwaffe. He was no longer just freezing men. He was testing rewarming on the edge of death. One experiment that February placed a prisoner half in ice, half under a heat lamp to observe differential tissue recovery. The man's skin cracked like glass. Rascher wrote, "Inconclusive." By April, he began selecting victims for what he called terminal observations. The phrase meant dissection before the heart stopped. His assistants had stopped asking questions months ago. They were shadows with clipboards, drinking schnapps to sleep at night. The air raid sirens reached Dachau that summer. Allied bombers thundered overhead, shaking the walls of the barracks. Prisoners whispered that liberation was coming. Rascher worked faster, trying to finish before the Reich collapsed. He was no longer sending reports north. He was hoarding them, fearing what might happen when the truth was known. In October 1944, Himmler ordered a review of all special medical projects. Rascher's name appeared near the top. Some in Berlin called him brilliant. Others called him reckless. Rumors spread that he had falsified data, that he had used unregistered prisoners, that he had hidden gold fillings from corpses. The SS began to watch him. The man who had frozen thousands was now under his own microscope. On November 25th, Himmler summoned him to Berlin. Rascher stood in the Grand Marble office, hands clasped behind his back, while Himmler read from a folder. "There are irregularities," the Reichsführer said softly. "Unauthorized experiments, questionable conduct, rumors about your wife's activities." Caroline had been caught stealing infants from hospitals. claiming they were for medical use. Even the SS had standards for madness. Rascher protested that every death had served science, that the data were irreplaceable. Himmler looked at him for a long moment and then said, "The Reich no longer has need of uncontrolled enthusiasm." 2 guards escorted Rascher out. He was reassigned to minor duties near Munich. The experiment stopped. The vats went dry. The cold lingered like a ghost. Winter came again, the last of the war. January 1945 froze the camp harder than ever. The front was collapsing, and the guards grew nervous. Trains of prisoners arrived from the east, skeletons in striped rags. They brought with them whispers from Auschwitz, from Buchenwald, from the ruins of the Empire of Death. Dachau became a reservoir of the dying. Rascher returned briefly in March, desperate to retrieve his notes. He bribed an officer to help him pack the files into crates marked medical supplies. He planned to flee south into the mountains. He never made it. The SS arrested him in April for corruption and treason. On the 26th, 3 days before the Americans reached Dachau, Sigmund Rascher was taken behind a shed and shot in the neck. His body was dumped in a ditch near the crematorium. The man who had turned science into murder died without a record. The next morning, April 27th, the guards began burning documents. Flames rose from barrels in the courtyard. Prisoners were ordered to carry crates of papers to the fire. Some slipped pages into their clothes, fragments of lists and signatures. One prisoner later said he saw a guard reading a page aloud and laughing. The page listed body temperatures at death. The guard said, "Even in dying they served us." 2 days later, the horizon filled with thunder again, but not from bombers. At 10 o'clock on April 29, 1945, the first armored vehicles of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division rolled through the gates of Dachau. The soldiers smelled the place before they saw it. The stench of rot and smoke clung to everything. They moved through the yard in stunned silence. One of them, Sergeant William Walsh, later said, "It was the smell of hell if hell had ever frozen." The barracks were filled with skeletal survivors, some too weak to raise their heads. The soldiers moved past them, searching for the source of the smoke, and reached the experimental blocks. The doors were open, the rooms half destroyed, but the equipment remained. Stainless steel vats, restraint belts, wires still attached to rusting electrodes. On a table, a logbook bound in black leather. Lieutenant Edward Franks picked it up. The first line read, "Test Series, February 15, 1942. The pages were full of numbers and notations in neat handwriting. He turned a few pages, then stopped at one that said, "Subject 27, revival attempt failed. Cause, heart rupture during rewarming." He closed the book and set it down carefully, as if it might still bite. A medic named James Ford found a set of photographs in a drawer. The pictures showed men in vats of ice, faces contorted, eyes wide. He held them up to the light, his hands shaking. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. They froze them alive. Another soldier looked at the photos and said, "These were doctors." No one answered. Outside, the survivors were gathering around the Americans, weeping, touching the uniforms like proof that the world still existed. Inside, the men of the 45th stared at the remnants of a science that had eaten its own soul. Before they left the block, one of them took the black notebook. "Evidence," he said. "The world needs to see this." He paused by the doorway and looked back once more at the vats. A thin layer of frost still clung to the metal, catching the light through the broken window. "They called it research," he murmured, "but this was murder." When the soldiers marched out, the sun was setting over Bavaria. The sky was red, the snow was melting, and the air carried the faint smell of chemicals. Behind them, Dachau stood silent, the cold finally lifting, but the chill of its work settling deep in every man who had seen it. The war had been over for a year, but the air in Nuremberg still smelled of smoke and ruin. The city was a skeleton of stone, every street a corridor of ash. In the shadow of its courthouse, a new kind of battlefield had been built, not of tanks or planes, but of chairs, microphones, and the ghosts of the dead. On December 9, 1946, the doors opened for the first session of what the papers called the Doctors Trial. Inside the Palace of Justice, 23 men in gray suits and prison sweaters took their seats behind the glass dock. They were physicians, professors, and officers of the SS Medical Corps. Some stared at the floor, some at the ceiling, none at the photographs displayed across from them. The photographs showed what their hands had done. The American prosecutors entered quietly, carrying folders marked Exhibit 160 to 199. Each file held a piece of Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, charts of body temperatures at death, autopsy photos, pages stamped geheim, secret. On the prosecution bench sat Colonel Telford Taylor, head of the U.S. legal team. His voice was calm when he spoke, but his hands trembled on the paper. "The defendants," he began, "are accused of murder and torture in the name of medical science." His eyes moved along the row of faces. "They killed men as though they were test animals, injected poison into their veins, froze them to death, boiled them alive, and recorded the results as data. They called it research. We call it crime." The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pencils. An interpreter's voice repeated the words in German, flat and lifeless. The accused sat motionless. On the second day, the Americans presented the documents recovered from Dachau. Among them was a black ledger marked Kälteversuche Dachau, 1942-1943. The clerk read aloud from one page, "Subject number 19, submersion time 53 minutes. Body temperature at death 26.4 degrees Celsius." Another page, "Subject 33, revival attempt with hot water, failed. Cause, heart rupture." The court reporters typed without looking up. When the first photographs appeared on the projector, even the translators fell silent. Men floating in ice baths, their eyes open, their bodies wired with electrodes. An American nurse in the gallery covered her mouth. One of the German defendants looked away. Another smiled faintly, as if admiring the clarity of the image. On January 10, 1947, a survivor took the stand. His name was Johann Kramer, a former political prisoner from Poland who had survived the freezing chamber by chance, pulled out at the last moment when Rascher wanted to test a rewarming method. His voice was thin but steady. "They said it was to help pilots," he told the court. "They said we were heroes for Germany. But we were not pilots. We were experiments." He described the cold, the lamps, the smell of burned skin. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Colonel Taylor stood and said softly, "Let the record show that this witness speaks for those who cannot." Behind the glass, one of the defendants rubbed his temples. Another wrote something in his notebook. The guards stood unmoving behind them, rifles slung across their chests. Outside the courthouse, snow fell again over the ruins of the city. The war had ended 20 months earlier, but it seemed to have followed them here, settling over the rubble like dust. The Americans who came to testify were soldiers now turned witnesses. Sergeant William Walsh, who had walked through Dachau on April 29, 1945, described what he saw to the court. "There were vats still half full of water," he said. "Tables with straps, and notebooks, everything tidy, like a laboratory waiting for its next patient." He paused, staring at the defendants. The only difference was that the patients were dead. On February 13, 1947, the prosecution read Himmler's letters to Rascher aloud. The courtroom listened as the interpreter's voice echoed, "Excellent progress. Continue experiments. Provide photographic evidence." The words hung in the air like frost. The defense argued that the research had been scientifically justified, that similar experiments had been performed by other nations. The judges watched quietly. When one defendant insisted he was only following orders, an American colonel whispered, "So did the gas valves." Day after day, the testimonies continued. Doctors explained how they measured pain by pulse rate, how they compared skin color as it froze, how they logged death as cessation of useful data. Their calmness was worse than rage. It was indifference polished to a mirror shine. By the spring of 1947, the evidence filled entire rooms. The Americans built exhibits out of the instruments found at Dachau: electrodes, clamps, hypothermia suits. Visitors from the press walked through the displays and came out pale. One journalist wrote, "These were not monsters in the fairy tale sense. They were men with stethoscopes." When the verdict came on August 19th, The courtroom was silent. 7 men were sentenced to death by hanging, 9 to prison, 7 acquitted. The presiding judge spoke slowly, his voice carrying through the hall. Medical science cannot excuse murder. Knowledge gained through crime is tainted with its blood. Afterward, the Americans walked out into the courtyard where the rubble glowed faintly under the moon. Colonel Taylor stood beside the nurse who had fainted at the photographs months earlier. She asked him, "Do you think they understand what they did?" He shook his head. They don't understand what they destroyed. That night, he returned to his quarters and wrote the closing line of his report. The world must never again allow science to become a weapon against man. A few days later, another committee met in the same building to draft a new document, a set of 10 principles for ethical research. They called it the Nuremberg Code. The first line read, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." The second, "No experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur." It was written not in hope, but in memory. Outside, Nuremberg's streets were still full of ruins. Children played among broken stones. The war's trophies were gone. Its lessons remained. In a small American archive, the Dachau notebooks lay preserved under glass. The ink faded, but the numbers still legible. 3 degrees, 53 minutes, 26 degrees at death. A language of cruelty, written with clinical grace. One American officer visiting the archive a year later opened the book and traced a finger over the neat handwriting. "They called it medicine," he whispered. The archivist standing beside him replied quietly, "And we turned their medicine into law." The man nodded, closing the cover gently. Outside the window, the snow began to fall again, white over the ruins, cold as history itself. The years after the trials were quiet. The world wanted to move on, to forget the frost that had bitten into its soul. But the cold never really left. In the early 1950s, the old camp at Dachau became a training ground for the new West German police. The barracks were scrubbed, the signs repainted, and the snow in the yard melted like memory under a spring sun. Only the experimental block remained locked, its doors chained, its windows boarded, as if the walls themselves were ashamed of what they had seen. In 1958, a small group of American medics returned on a study tour. Among them was James Ford, the man who had once lifted the photographs out of Rascher's drawer. His hair was gray now, his hands slower. He walked across the empty yard where the watchtowers still stood, his boots crunching in gravel. Inside Block 5, the air was stale and cold. The vats had been removed, but the stains on the floor remained. He knelt, touched the concrete, and felt the chill rise through his fingertips. "Still cold," he said softly. The German caretaker beside him didn't reply. Ford looked around the room and whispered, "You can clean it, but you can't warm it." Outside, the church bells rang in the town beyond the fence. Life had gone on. Children walked to school, shops opened, and the trains rolled past the old siding where prisoners had once arrived. But inside the minds of those who had seen it, time never thawed. In the 1960s, survivors began to write their memories. Some were frail men now, blind or crippled from the experiments. One wrote from Krakow, "When I close my eyes, I hear the water again. It is always February." Another, a priest who had witnessed the rewarming tests, wrote, "They wanted to save their pilots but forgot their souls." Their books sold quietly, read mostly by historians and students who could still stomach the photographs. In America, the files of the Nuremberg trials were boxed and stored in archives. Few opened them. The war had become a chapter in textbooks, a black and white photograph in the corner of a page. But among the veterans who had walked through Dachau, it was never just history. It was something that lived behind the eyelids, an image of frost, of faces turning blue, of notebooks filled with numbers that once had names. In 1972, an American journalist researching war crimes uncovered Rascher's letters to Himmler. The story appeared in a Boston paper under the headline, "The Doctors Who Froze for Science." The article quoted the Nuremberg transcripts and listed every confirmed victim by number. For a week, readers wrote letters demanding to know why no one had taught this in schools. By the next month, the story was gone from the headlines. The world preferred heroes to corpses, yet the memory endured in smaller ways. In 1983, a bronze plaque was placed outside the reconstructed Dachau Memorial Site. The inscription read in German and English, "May the example of those who were tortured and murdered here remind us forever of the value of human life." Every year, American visitors left small flags beside it. On cold mornings, the metal froze, and the words became stiff under frost. By the 1990s, only a handful of witnesses remained. Colonel Telford Taylor died in 1998. In his last interview, he said, "The law we made at Nuremberg was not for them, it was for us." He meant that the line between science and cruelty had to be guarded every day, even in peace. That same winter, a film crew from the United States arrived at Dachau to shoot a documentary. They interviewed an old woman who had been a nurse in the camp's infirmary in 1945. She remembered the first Americans entering, the way they stared at the vats. "They didn't speak," she said. "They just looked." One of them touched the water and began to cry. The crew filmed the corridors, the bare walls, the barred windows. In the editing room, one of them noticed how the sound echoed longer there than anywhere else, as if the building still breathed. Late that evening, after the filming ended, the caretaker turned off the lights. The cameras stopped, the tourists left, and silence settled again. The room grew colder, as it always did after dusk. On the far wall, faint under layers of paint, the outline of a number was still visible, perhaps written in pencil by an assistant 50 years earlier. Next to it, a smaller mark, like the trace of a hand, outside. Snow began to fall. The same white snow that had covered Dachau in 1942. The same that had fallen on April 29, 1945, when the 45th Infantry Division broke the gates. It fell softly now on the roofs, on the yard, on the monument where candles flickered in the wind. The air was silent except for the faint ringing of a church bell in the distance. In the archive across the street, the black notebook still lay under glass. Visitors leaned over to read the slanted handwriting, the columns of numbers, the small final words, "Subject expired." Some walked away quickly. Some stayed and stared. One young American soldier on leave, visiting with his unit, whispered, "It looks like a lab report." The guide nodded. "It is. But each line is a man." That night the soldier wrote in his journal before leaving Germany. They said it was for science. But when you stand where they froze them, you feel what science without mercy sounds like. It's quiet, like snow. He left the camp at dusk, the same path the liberators had taken half a century earlier. Behind him, the memorial flame burned against the wind. A single line of warmth in a place that had none, and as darkness closed over Dachau again, the frost crept back across the windows of Block 5. The cold had never truly gone. It waited there, silent, reminding anyone who entered what happens when men forget that a cure means saving life, not measuring how long it takes to die.